Okay, so again, before this week's chapter, I just want to remind you all about the protest that's going to be happening next week on June 25th at 1146 East 9th Street in Flatbush at 3 p.m. We're going to be protesting outside of the house of Chaim David Zweibel, who's the head of Aguda, and we're going to be protesting Aguda's opposition to the Child Victims Act and their continued insistence that victims of child sexual abuse have to ask a rabbi before going to the authorities. I just want to explain a little about the Child Victims Act. The Child Victims Act is a law designed to eliminate the statute of limitations for criminal and civil sexual abuse cases. Right now, the statute of limitations is at 23, at age 23. Once a victim, is past age 23, they can no longer file a claim against their abusers. They can't file charges against their abusers. And there are so many people who have been abused and have no recourse. They can't get their rapists or their abusers arrested or registered or put in jail, punished. They can't sue them for compensation. And these people go on to abuse more people. And the victims see them in their communities. They continue to see them in their shuls. They continue to see them in schools. They continue to see them working with children. And there is nothing that they could do, according to the law, to get the word out, to make sure that they can't work around children anymore, to make sure that they serve time and pay up for the crimes that they committed and the abuse that they perpetrated. Eliminating the statute of limitations would allow them to get justice regardless of what their age is, especially since, on average, studies show that it takes, on average, between 10 and 30 years for an abuser for an abuse victim to come forward. If someone's abused when they're 15, 10 years later is when they're 25. That's 2 years past the statute of limitation, and they have no legal recourse whatsoever to get their abuser prosecuted or to get some monetary compensation for the damages of the abuse. And another thing that the that the Child Victims Act would do is open up a 1-year window retroactively, where people whose statute of limitations have already passed can file lawsuits within that 1-year window to take their abusers to court and get some justice and some compensation for their abuse. And it's not just about money. Firstly, it's about getting justice in the sense that, getting a verdict that says that this person was guilty of a crime to you. And secondly, it costs roughly $1 million, according to many estimates, for treatment over lifetime for survivors of child sexual abuse. $1 million is a lot of money that a lot of people don't have. A lot of people don't have enough money to get access to the treatment that they really need. So opening up a civil window, the retroactive window where they could sue their abusers to get the money that they need for treatment, is incredibly important. It's about so much more than money. It's about healing and it's about justice. And please come out next week, January 25th, 1146 East 9th Street at 3 p.m. to protest against Aguda's opposition to this bill. They're more concerned about their institutions and they're more concerned about money than they are about the victims in their community that have been victimized because of their policies. All right, so last week we discussed, what it would be like when my mother was decompensating. More specifically, what the abuse was like in those cases. In those 2 months periods when she was decompensating. But that's not to say that there weren't any good times. When she was level, when she was normal, when she was on her meds, she was basically my best friend. She didn't even seem like my mother most of the time. And I guess it makes sense, seeing as how young she was when she got married. And like I said last week, her getting married at 19 basically cut her life off at that point. She never matured past that point because her life basically, when you get married, you're supposed to, settle down, and this is the rest of your life. And that's the way it was for her, except she got a divorce 2 years later, and she wound up in the hospital and diagnosed with bipolar. So, for her life really ended at 19, for her specifically. And aside from that, she didn't really have the responsibilities of motherhood for very long before she had to move back in with her parents. And my grandparents really raised me. She was sort of just there to, play mother, I guess. I mean, she really the heavy lifting was done by my grandparents. She didn't really have the responsibilities of motherhood if she didn't want them for very long. It was almost like she was just another, 20-year-old sibling also being raised by my grandparents. In general, she slept most of the day. Her meds knocked her out. Besides, my grandparents were there to make sure I had dinner, did my homework, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, got up, went to the bus. They were there to really take care of the responsibilities if she wasn't. So, she didn't really have the responsibilities of motherhood, and I didn't really see her as such because of that. So there wasn't really much left for her to do other than be a friend to me. That's not to say that she never did anything motherly with me. It just wasn't consistent. Like, she'd often be there in the morning to help me get dressed and ready for school, hurrying me up when I ran late. When we had a TV, we'd watch the morning TV shows together, and then she'd get me onto the bus. But for the most part, she was just a friend, and that worked just fine. I understood that my mother and living situation were different, but I just accepted it as a kid. Like, your living situation as a kid, it just becomes normal. If that's the normal you've always known, then that's the normal that you accept. When I came home, if she were up and around, we'd have dinner and watch some TV. We'd talk about stuff. We did that a lot, talking. More than most kids do with their parents, I think. I told her a lot of stuff, and she told me a lot of stuff about herself, too. That was pretty much one of our favorite pastimes. And, by the way, it still is my favorite pastime, just sitting around talking to people. Not with her, but with people in general. My idea of a good time is just hanging out and sitting around talking about stuff, maybe drinking a beer or something, but, just sitting around talking is fun for me. So that's pretty much what we would do. And Shabbos afternoons in particular were great for that, especially the long afternoons. She'd lie down in her room, and I'd play ball, bouncing it off the wall at the far end of the room and catching it, and we'd talk until she fell asleep. And then I'd just keep playing ball until she woke up, or I'd go outside and play with some of the neighborhood kids. Shabbos in general was pretty nice. It was a little bit boring at home. When my grandfather was still alive, he would lead the Shabbos meal, interspersing the meal with zmiros from his childhood, which weren't particularly good. He wasn't a good singer, and we would suppress groans and roll our eyes, but it was part of our family tradition, including the groaning and eye rolling. It made Shabbos feel like Shabbos. That's how we knew it was Shabbos. If he was singing and we were rolling our eyes, and that was Shabbos. When my grandfather died, my grandmother did her best to keep Shabbos, as traditional as possible in our family. She really tried to keep it up. She tried to keep it as similar as it had been before. And to her credit, she put up a pretty valiant effort. But eventually, we let some of the traditions go, especially the singing. My grandmother was even worse at it. We also started reading at the table. Everybody would bring their own book. It was still a family meal, but we just read together as a family. My grandmother had prepared food, and we would eat it and read our books, and every so often we'd look up and talk, and then we'd go back to reading our books, and then we'd look up and talk again. It wasn't typical, but it was ours, and it was nice. It was what it was. It was our normal. She used to take me out to eat a lot, my mother. There was this one restaurant in Borough Park. It's no longer open. It used to be on 13th Avenue. It was one of the few kosher delis still around. And by kosher deli, I mean actual hechshered kosher deli. There are a lot of delis that keep opening up that claim to be kosher but don't have a hechsher, so the people who actually keep kosher and eat that kind of food can't actually eat there. No, this was one of the few remaining actually kosher delis that a person who keeps kosher can walk into and get a good deli meal at. I loved that place. Not always the people so much, but I never really had a charitable view of the people my mother hung out with. Mainly because a lot of them actually were scumbags, but the food, the ambiance, the authenticity, it was amazing. Their corned beef sandwiches were out of this world. The plate of pickles that they gave was better than candy. I remember having my first cream soda with my mother at that deli. It's still my favorite kind of soda, Dr. Brown's cream soda. And she'd take me there in part because she wanted to hang out with her friends, and in part because she knew I really, really liked going there. So we would hang out there as much as possible, money permitting. And we'd sit around and we'd do what we did best. We'd eat and we'd talk. And later on, when she started to work and had more money and more restaurants worth going to started opening up in Borough Park, sadly at the expense of some of the old classics like this deli that we used to go to, we'd go visit the new ones and we'd critique them and get to know the staff and get to know our favorite dishes and stuff. And it was fun. There was a time we went to Washington, D.C. For Pesach because I'd been begging to go for months. I love D.C. I absolutely love it. It's my favorite city to go to in the U.S. Now, granted, I haven't traveled much outside of the U.S., but in the U.S., I absolutely love going to D.C. Every so often, I'll just get up and go and spend a day there, even though it's 4 hours driving each way from where I live. And I love it. I love the buildings. I love the history. I love the importance of the place. The feeling that world-changing events are going on around me. Say what you will about Congress, but when they do something, regardless of whether you like it or not, they still are changing the way your life works. And sometimes they're changing the way the world works. And that sense of perspective that all gives me really appeals to me. It makes me love D.C. as a city. And we went on Pesach. We booked a cheap room at a Days Inn, like 45 minutes away from D.C. in Silver Spring, and we took the Amtrak down, which itself is cool. Amtrak is a good way to travel. If you haven't traveled by Amtrak, you may want to do it just for fun. It's a little expensive, but you really get what you pay for. So we dropped our bags off at the hotel when we got there. We made some matzah and tuna fish sandwiches, which is the staple of Jews on the go on Pesach. Every Jew traveling has matzah and tuna fish. And we headed out to see the site. To see the sites. We went to the Air and Space Museum, we went to the Spy Museum, we went to some of the monuments, and then we collapsed back in our hotel room after walking around all day and watched TV until it was time to go to sleep. Actually, I stayed up late that night preparing the sandwiches for the next day. She went to sleep, and I just stayed up, and I felt like I was really taking care, like I was taking care of her, and it felt good being responsible for that, especially since she was shelling out for the trip, and I knew that she didn't have a lot of money. And the next day, we saw more sights, and then we went home, and it was I think the only trip I ever took as a kid. With my family, that is, the only really big trip. My grandparents didn't really believe in that sort of thing, in travel, that sort of thing. My grandmother couldn't understand why you'd go someplace else, as far as D.C., to experience a city, when we lived in Brooklyn, a 30-minute train ride from New York City. And what does D.C. have that New York City doesn't? As far as she was concerned, why would we need to go all the way there? And we have museums in the city. What, do you need tall buildings? We've got tall buildings in the city, right? And of course, there are also bad things happening through all the good times, as I talked about in the last chapter, and I'll keep talking about it. That's what the rest of part one is going to be about. But it didn't matter. There still were good times until things got really bad, and then there weren't good times. And honestly, this chapter has been one of the hardest things I've shared. It was hard to write. It was hard to film. It was hard to get into because I don't really want to remember the good times. They're all poisoned by the terrible things she put me through. And why does it matter, really? Why does it matter that there were good times? Why does it matter that we were friends or we used to talk a lot? Why does it matter that she took me to restaurants or to D.C. that one time? Why does it matter that to her friends she was someone that they could count on if they needed a place to stay or a meal to eat or a shoulder to cry on? Why does it matter that to her friends my being her son gave me privileged status in their eyes because they all loved her so much? It shouldn't matter. There isn't enough good in this world. There's not enough people to help on this planet for her to make up for what she did to me. None of it is forgivable. None of it can be mitigated. So why the hell does any of the good stuff matter? I really, really wish that she was the monster I remember her as. I wish that she were this one-dimensional cretin, some wretched, twisted, obviously malevolent gargoyle that I could point to and objectively show my audience without having to open my mouth what the face of evil looks like. But I can't. Because monsters in the real world are rarely so accommodating. That's why it's so much harder for me to talk about this than anything else I'm going to share. This was so much harder than anything else I'm going to share, and there's some messed up stuff coming. And it's why so many abusers get away with it. It's why the public is so quick to attribute devious motives to survivors who prosecute or sue their abusers. It's why people, think that it's all about the money when survivors file civil suits instead of realizing that it's really about justice and treatment. It's why college towns and little hamlets where high school football is king, where sports is everything, are so quick to come to the defense of athletes who excel on the field and in service to their community, who are held up as shining examples of the communal ideal while getting away with raping their friends friends and classmates. Abusers never look like monsters. They never have the mark of Cain on their foreheads. They're never the obvious monsters we want them to be. And that's really the scariest thing about monsters. Not the ones that kids look for under their beds or in their closets. Not the ones that seem real but exist only in their imagination, scaring them out of their bed and into their parents' arms. No, monsters are scary because they're the ones you instinctually believe will protect you from the things that scare you. They're the ones you run to from the imaginary monsters. They're scary because they've already proved to you that they'll help you in a pinch and be your friend when you need one, or be a friend to somebody else. They've proved themselves to somebody else to not be monstrous. And when they do monstrous things to you, no one wants to believe it because of the good they've done. Real monsters, the ones that actually exist, the ones like my mother, who are beloved by the people who know them while doing monstrous things to their victims, are so scary because it's so damn hard to believe that they're actually monsters. And that's why I remember the good times, and that's why I mention it, only to remind people that if anybody ever tells you that an abuser didn't do it because they know the abuser and they know the abuser is a good person, it's BS, because monsters don't work like that.